For those who were not here yesterday, you missed a good day. We had some good sessions. We did a review, and then we covered from, in fact, we looked a little bit about the Jewish establishment, which was quite interesting. And then we walked through chapters 13 to 16. Patrick did chapter 17 just then in the class, and I've got chapter 18. So we are looking at the betrayal and the denials of Jesus. Now, what we looked at yesterday, Jesus has been preparing his apostles for what was about to happen. A discussion started in the upper room. At some point now, they are arriving at the Garden of Gethsemane. In the last section, John, this section from now to about chapter 20, John more closely resembles the other Gospels, although he is still bringing in unique material. But he does cover a lot of the same incidents, but maybe has a few extra bits in there as well. And he leaves out some of what they recorded as well. So, in fact, you should have noticed yesterday when we're in chapter 13, it doesn't talk about the memorial at all, but it talks about other things. And so John's like that. They arrive at the garden, it's not specified, but it is the Garden of Gethsemane. We know that from the other writers. This is what you visit today when you go into Israel and Jerusalem. If you want to see an olive garden, it's at the foot of the Mount of Olives, so it probably was included within the Garden of Gethsemane. I have a feeling it was a whole lot bigger than that in the first century. But the garden would have been a plot of land. It may have had more than olives in it. Variety of fruit trees and shrubs would have grown in there. The Net Bible Study notes, or the Net Bible Study translates it as an orchard. And that's probably a reasonable description of what it was there. This orchard garden was called Gethsemane. Literally, that would mean a place of oil presses. Hence, we get the idea of the olive trees, the olive oil. Luke and John mentioned that this was a place they frequently visited, although Luke does not mention it by name. Jesus left 8 of the disciples at the entrance to watch. He took Peter, James, and John on in. And then he left and spent some time in prayer to God. That's in addition to what we just saw in chapter 17. By the way, this part's not recorded by John. This is, again, another view. There's some very old olive trees within this garden. But there's a chapel. There's always a chapel in Israel. There's a chapel built over what they say is the stone where he prayed. Maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. I have a feeling there's a lot of stones in the area he could have been on, so I don't hold that. But people like to have a preciseness that sometimes I don't think is there. But nevertheless, that's what you see inside that church building. But one thing I thought was interesting, when you go out of the building and just look, that's what you see. I mean, that took that from the steps of that chapel there. So he's in that rough area. One thing that tells you, it says he turns around and looks. Now, that's the Crusader wall, okay? But there was a Roman wall. There was a wall, a Jewish wall that was there, a gate there. So as Judas starts on the way down with those with him, it's at night. There are no street lights. Keep that in mind. I don't think we can really perceive no street lights, but no street lights. But he would have seen the torches. He would have seen that procession coming towards him. He could not have missed it as it's coming. That's more like what it would have looked like, we think, in the first century. That's a huge model of Jerusalem. In fact, it could fill this entire building, I think, plus a little bit more. But it's a huge model of first century Jerusalem. So, getting into the text, while Jesus was speaking with the 11, Judas arrived with a large crowd from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. So from that, we can see that the Jewish leaders are in on it. We talk about the priests, the scribes, and the elders. That's the groups that made up the Sanhedrin. The Jewish leadership is behind this. It's late, maybe midnight, maybe 1 o'clock in the morning. It's late at night. And they're coming. They're armed. They're armed with swords. They're armed with clubs. And it included, John says, a regiment of soldiers. There would be some of the armed guards from the temple, but John seems to indicate there's some Roman soldiers present. He uses a term in Greek, a cohort, and that's referring to Roman soldiers. They may have been there simply to keep the peace, to make sure that there is not a uprising going on there. Now, a cohort consisted of 600 soldiers. Not sure there's quite that many, but I think he is indicating there was quite a force that showed up in order to take Jesus. Of course, Judas is there leading them. Perhaps because they had been so unsuccessful when they previously tried to arrest him. We saw some of that going into this week as we did a review yesterday. Maybe that's why they sent so many. He's not going to get away this time. But most likely it's some soldiers from a cohort. They're carrying torches. They're carrying lanterns. And Luke tells us that the betrayal sign was a kiss. Jesus, though, anticipated these events. He wasn't surprised. We saw that as we're going through yesterday. He kept referring to what was about to happen. This doesn't surprise him. So the mob comes. Jesus approaches them. John says, he asked, who are you looking for? Obviously, they're after somebody. Who are you looking for? Tom Wright points out, Jesus doesn't hide. He has no reason to. The Father has given him a cup to drink, and he's going to drink it. The agony in the garden, so movingly pictured in Matthew, Mark, and especially Luke, is missing from John. John has shown us already how 3 times over Jesus' heart has been deeply troubled. The moment has now passed. He is ready. So John recorded 3 times he was deeply troubled about it. Of course, Matthew, Mark, and especially Luke, as Tom Wright points out, recorded that prayer in the garden and the distress he was in. So he says to the mob as they're showing up, who are you looking for? And they said, Jesus the Nazarene. And Jesus says, I am. Interesting, I am. And the mob fell back away. Possibly they had heard about Jesus. Maybe when he identifies himself, and by the way, they would not probably have known what he looked like. Keeping in mind, they didn't have television. They didn't have newspapers with pictures in them. Unless they had heard Jesus or had him pointed out, they have no idea what he looked like. So when Jesus says, I'm the one you're looking for, I am, although that's ego eime, which we talked about yesterday. Maybe they're expecting something miraculous. Maybe that's why they fall back, as he doesn't seem to be afraid of them. He directly approached them. And though I sort of wonder if it was because he said, I am. Some of our translations add extra words in there, but in the Greek it's I am. Now maybe the Jewish element there knew what he was saying. Tom Wright again says, his answer is simple and shocking. I am. In the setting, of course, this means I'm the one or that's me. But for John, with all the I am sayings throughout his book in the foreground, there's no doubt what he wants us to hear. This is the simple, clear, and world-changing statement. The vulnerable man standing before you in the garden, glimpsed in the flickering torchlight, is the one who from all eternity was equal with the Father. He is the I am, the bread of life, the light of the world, the resurrection and the life, the way, the truth, and the life. Something of this is the only reasonable explanation why, in this version, the arresting party stumble backwards and fall to the ground. Their reaction, whether voluntary or involuntary, mirrors what people in the Bible do when coming face to face with God. I thought he made a good point there. There seems to be something going on when Jesus makes that response. Andrew Patterson wrote, the people bow down or prostrate themselves before a king. And this crowd did the same, albeit unwittingly, before King Jesus. Although they were representatives of the Roman world superpower and the Jewish national leaders, they fell down before Jesus, the King of Kings. So John is emphasizing that this Jesus was no ordinary character of history. He was none other than the Son of God, God's own promised rescuer. Interesting how this begins. So they fall back. Jesus asks them again, "Who are you looking for?" And they again replied, "Jesus the Nazarene." And Jesus again told them he's the one that they wanted, but he asked, "Let the rest go. Let the disciples go. You're not interested in them. It's me that you want." And by the way, that's taking that role of the good shepherd that he had spoken of earlier. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And that's what we see happening here. It would seem that it was at this time that Judas walked up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him tenderly as a friend. In Mark's account, the Greek word is an emphatic form of the verb to suggest more than the usual affection. He made a big deal out of it because that was the betrayal sign. He wanted them to make sure that they knew this is the guy. So he makes a big deal of it. Peter, though, impulsive as ever, and he attacks the high priest's slave and cuts off his ear. Peter was showing what he had stated earlier, that he was willing to lay down his life for his Lord. And you've probably heard this before, but do you realize how difficult it is for a right-handed person to cut off somebody else's right ear? Yeah, you do it from behind, I guess. So maybe he did it from behind, I don't know. But some have suggested that if he was facing him, right, and the right ear is over here, that he may have been going for something else and missed. May have gone for his whole head. Who knows? But he cuts off his ear. Slave's name is Malchus. Some have suggested that John may have included that name because he was either known to the readers, that's possible, or but later becoming a Christian, or it could be that John just simply knew it and included it, because we find out in some of the accounts that John was known to the high priest's house. So he may have known who this servant was. Luke recorded that there were only 2 swords with the disciples against all these soldiers. So they're a bit outnumbered, but Peter's willing to get in there. Jesus told Peter to put his sword away. He wouldn't accept the sword as the way to defend his cause. If he were to be rescued, how would the scriptures then be fulfilled? He's not looking for a rescue. He says, "Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Of course, the cup he refers to there was the suffering that he had experienced that he was going to experience to accomplish the atonement for the sins of the world. David Roper quotes Wiersbe. Peter's intentions were good, but he used the wrong weapon at the wrong time for the wrong purpose with the wrong motive. He wants to defend Jesus, but this wasn't the time or the place. Luke also records that Jesus healed Malchus' ear. He put it back on. And by the way, if Jesus hadn't intervened, there could have been a slaughter there. But he sort of diffuses the situation by putting the ear back on. The other accounts record Jesus speaking to the mob, all the disciples then fleeing and leaving Jesus alone. Jesus was bound, I'm assuming his hands, and led away under arrest, accompanied by all the priests and the Jewish leaders, as well as the guard. At some point, the Roman soldiers would have left the party because they had Jesus. they would have no longer been needed, and they would not have been welcome in the high priest's home anyway, and that's where they're headed. So at some point they leave. The 11 had fled while Peter, and we presume John, followed behind. And we're going to see them periodically at the trial and then the death of Jesus. Jesus was first taken to the house of Annas. Patrick talked a little about that in the first lesson yesterday, about this whole establishment, all that's going on. Annas had been high priest from the year 6 to the year 15. Of course, we're about the year 30 now. But he had been deposed by the Roman governor Valerius Gratus, replaced over the next few years by 5 of his sons, and now his son-in-law. Boy, they went through high priest quickly. Not what we read about when we studied the Old Testament. No, it wasn't that at all. It was very much a political position. The Jews still considered Annas the high priest in some way, because the old law had specified that the term of the high priest was for life. So he still has the respect of being high priest. Annas had a great influence over the people, and a great influence over his son-in-law Caiaphas. Merrill Tenney wrote about him and said he wielded a powerful influence and was regarded as high priest emeritus. Maybe that's a good way of looking at it, because we use that term. In this case, he was consulted that he might render a preliminary opinion to establish the nature of the accusations, which should be ratified by the Sanhedrin in a formal meeting on the following morning. The reference in verse 14 is back to chapter 11, verses 49 to 50, where that they had taken counsel to kill Jesus. And so this is where all this is headed. John recalled this to show the type of man that Caiaphas was, and to show what type of justice could be expected from him. In fact, when you think about all that's going on here he is, Jesus on trial. And if you remember back when Nicodemus intervened, he said, does an accused person have the right for a hearing? Well, see, they've already passed the sentence. They've already decided what's going to happen to Jesus. They just got to find a reason to do it now. We've seen things like that in films and maybe even in history that happens. Caiaphas was a high priest officially that year. He served as high priest from the year 25 to the year 36. And so he actually had quite a long term as high priest. The court that he's taken to was the residence of the high priest. And this building, this chapel here in Jerusalem, is one they have identified as, on that site, was Caiaphas' house. Most of these things, there is some good evidence as to why they say that. People were identifying those a long time ago. So there's good evidence for that. But you can see it there. Jerusalem's very much a hilly place, by the way. You can see that very much there. Now, if you were to strip away a lot of those houses, because they would have been there in the first century, you could see more of the hill, couldn't you? It's just when we build things over, it sort of obscures some of what's going on. And if you look here, this is taken from that place, just looking back the other direction. You can see the edge of the temple there on the left of the picture. So they're not that far from that. The valley there, the hill in the background is the Mount of Olives. We got the valley of the Kidron Valley there as well. You just start seeing some forest, some trees there, which had been sort of the Gethsemane area in that photo. But there is a lot of excavation that's been done. They found a lot of first century buildings there in that particular location. I mentioned this yesterday. There's a first century road that led into Jerusalem from that particular gate in the wall. But this is the little courtyard they have now, whether it was there or not, I haven't the foggiest, but it's close there. But that's what they have as the courtyard today. It's now early morning, okay? It's still before dawn. Jesus is taken to have a trial of sorts by those who had already passed a death sentence against him. John, we find, was known to the high priest's household. This, by the way, is a sculpture they have there in that little courtyard, depicting Peter on the left, and of course, throwing up his hands. You know what he's doing. We're going to get there. But he was known to the high priest's household. So he got entrance into the courtyard, and he got Peter in too. Maid approaches him, knowing that John was one of Jesus' disciples, asks Peter, "Are you one too?" Peter denies it. First denial. Jesus had predicted this. First denial. You wonder, as he's denying Jesus, if that's coming back. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Jesus said I would do it. I knew I wouldn't, but I've done it. So, yeah. The Jewish officers, the servants of the high priest, had made a charcoal fire. You can see the depiction of the charcoal fire on that little statue there. And it was cold that evening. By the way, if you're in an area there and it's sort of late March, early April, and it's clear skies, it's going to get cold at night. And plus the fact they're way up in the mountains. And Jerusalem was a bit cooler as a whole than the area down in Jericho. But Peter edged his way to the fire. He wanted to get warm. Narrative goes back to Jesus. Again, we have this sort of backwards and forwards here. It goes back to Jesus, picking up in verse 19 from verse 14. High priest asked Jesus questions. I think this is Annas here, and it's identified in the other Gospels. Although they had already decided that Jesus must die, they need a reason. They need something that's going to uphold, that the Romans will approve of. So the questioning seems to be to that end. We've got to get something on Jesus. Now, Jesus' teaching, think about it. It's been very public. And everything that he's done has been very much in the open. He wasn't hiding what he was doing. He didn't work in secret. The Pharisees had even watched him closely. They've been doing this for a while to try to figure out what they could get against Jesus. Tom Wright wrote, when it comes to his teaching, he's hardly going to start giving them a resume of everything he'd said over the past 2 or 3 years. Nobody in a hastily convened night hearing would be in the mood to listen to parables, and much that he has said can only be said that way. They weren't ready for a careful explanation of the ways in which the kingdom of God both is and isn't coming. The difference between the normal revolution of Jesus' contemporaries and the radically different revolution he was pioneering. Go and ask the people who heard me, he says. They'll tell you. So when they said, what is it? He said, well, go ask those who heard me. They've heard me. They can tell you what I've been teaching. One of the officers caught the implication of Jesus' reply and slapped him. The officer violated principles of both law and justice because Jesus wasn't showing disrespect to the high priest. He was simply stating the truth. Jesus didn't fall back from the attacker, but he challenged what the attacker had done. He challenged the officer to justify his actions by producing the evidence of what he had said to the high priest that was disrespectful. If not, then justify his own illegal actions. See, Jesus' appearance at this, it really wasn't even a proper hearing or trial. It's a mock trial. There was no official sanction for what was going on. This image here, by the way, is in one of the walls of that particular church building where they say this happens. They got all sorts of depictions of what they say happened that night. But Andrew Patterson says, many commentators make the point that the questioning that Jesus went through at the hands of Annas and Caiaphas was illegal. It went against many of the established rules and regulations for trying a prisoner. It should not have happened at night. It should not have been a private interrogation. And the case should have been proven by the questioning of witnesses, not the accused. I mean, they're doing it all wrong, but they're trying to catch him out on something. He was being held for the purpose of seeking sufficient grounds to condemn him, which could then be produced and used at a real trial, which would follow later. Merrill Tenney said, if he had done wrong, it should be proved legally. If not, he did not deserve to suffer. The few words of this hearing showed that the trial would be unfair because unbelief had already condemned Jesus and was merely seeking testimony to justify its attitude. It's at that stage that Annas sent Jesus to Caiaphas. Now, John does not seem to record that part, but it's at that stage that there was a sort of a shift in what went on there. But we go back to Peter. And again, we find him denying that he was one of Jesus' disciples. This is probably not taking place over a few minutes. I mean, this is hours long. This is going on through the night. So maybe it's an interval of around an hour or so between the second and the third denials. The earlier questions that Peter was asked have been easy to evade. The last one that they accused him of was probably from an eyewitness to his being in the garden. Matthew and Mark recorded that he denied it with cursing and swearing. He's trying to emphasize, I am not his disciple. I don't know the man. I know nothing about him. And yet, it looks like somebody had seen him there in the garden. Maybe even seen him cut off Malchus's ear. And it's at that point that the rooster crowed. And the rooster's on top of the statue there, on the column there. It's at that point the rooster crowed. Luke records that Jesus turned and looked right at Peter when that happened. And Peter left the area in bitter tears. That would have really cut to you. He's denied him 3 times. He knows it. And now he knows that Jesus knows it as well. He goes and this is the depiction in the basement area of this building. He goes and weeps on a rock. And they have it being near there. In fact, they say that it's this very rock that he went and wept on. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But that's built into the building's built. There's a little sub-auditorium there in the basement. I think it's only the first trip I was on over there that we went down that far. But John doesn't include the hearing before Caiaphas, dealt with by the other gospel writers. But all this took place over, as I mentioned, over a number of hours. Now, I don't think he was necessarily on trial the whole time. What did they do with him in between all this? Well, here's what they tell you there at Caiaphas' house. They've discovered holding cells, and this is what this is depicting. Holding cells underneath this convent. The building is built over the rock there. And these are the holding cells they found. It has a bench cut out into the rock. They got places you could tie people up. It's very possible that that's where they put Jesus, in between all the hearings that were going on. Here's another view of that particular, this is on to the left of that they've discovered down there. So very, very fascinating what they found in these cells. It's now close to sunrise. Most likely we're looking at 4, 5 o'clock in the morning, maybe even slightly later. And Jesus is going to be taken to the Roman court of Pilate, the Praetorium, which was also Pilate's residence. The trial at Caiaphas' house had been before part of the Sanhedrin, although the meeting was an illegal forum. But the result of it was a death sentence. But the problem is, the Jewish high court did not have the power to carry out a death sentence. So they had to get approval from the ruling Roman authorities to carry out executing Jesus. And so they're going to get approval from Pilate. Patrick mentioned him some yesterday. And of course, that's where we're going to pick up in 2 weeks' time. So that's where we're going to leave him. He's on trial. He's heading for the Romans and to be on trial. And John has a fascinating depiction of that trial before Pilate, which I'm looking forward to getting into next time. But just to summarize what we see here, throughout the Gospels, and we mentioned this yesterday, throughout the Gospels, it's always he slips away, his hour had not yet come. The time has not come. It wasn't time yet. Suddenly, here we are. It is time. This is when he is going to, when everything's coming to its fulfillment. Jesus had been betrayed. The disciples had disappeared. Peter and John following at a distance. The hearings before Annas and then Caiaphas led to the Jews, and I think in particular here the Jewish leadership, wanting Jesus executed. And they thought they now had a reason. They thought they had a reason. Of course, Peter denied Jesus 3 times, just as Jesus had predicted that he would do. And we're going to get on into Pilate in our next lesson. When I originally did this, I had another one here, and I should have added that one there. But anyway, I now know why my notes were the way they are. So come back in 2 weeks' time. 2 weeks yesterday, we'll begin again. And we're going to have Jack join us to teach through this. We're going to look at the rest of John's Gospel. And also, we're going to pull out some themes that John emphasizes throughout that. As this is really more of a class session, any questions, comments, observations, or as Patrick would say, sonnets? Anybody have anything to throw in? Yes, Scott.
Right about the European as almost a small way miracle that foreshadows forgiveness on the cross, in the sense that was basically a capital offense that Peter committed. That Jesus heals the man and removes the sin, the tragedy, as if it never happened, which is ultimately what he's about.
Oh, it's a good picture, isn't it? Yeah, I like that. I like that. If you did it here, Scott, the fact that Malchus's ear was cut off, that was a capital offense that Peter did, attacking somebody else, not lobbing off their ear. Even under the old law, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I mean, the punishment would have been he lost his. But Jesus heals it, and it's just as if it had never happened. Yeah. So he can't be condemned for doing it because he's fine. And again, that's the way Jesus treats our sins, isn't it? Just as if they had never happened. Justified. And that's the idea. That's a good point. That's a good point. Any other observations, comments?
You said previously, John, that Pilate and Caiaphas were both high priests at the same time.
No, they are recognized by the title high priest, but they served, as their appointment from Rome, which is not proper anyway, but Annas was 6 to 15, Caiaphas was 25 to 36, and 5 other sons were in there too. So, it was very much a political appointment as far as Rome was concerned, because they were very much dealing with it themselves. They were trying to control matters. And interesting, the Jews sort of went along with it. Strange, isn't it? It shows how far they had drifted away from the truly following God. We can't compromise like that. So, but Annas did have a lot of political clout still, and the people respected him. So, we will close with that. Slightly shorter than I was hoping, but nevertheless, we got through what we needed to do. By the way, I also will mention that we do have our study week coming up, Bassenfeld Manor, 28th October to 1st of November. Register for it online. It's a week of good study, good fellowship, and it's a good time together. So if you're interested in that, I know some from here have attended in years past, but if you're interested, see me or go online and register. And there is a cost to it. It's there because you don't get these places to stay for free, but it does cover all food and lodging as well as handouts and things like that. So anyway, we're going to move from here into our worship.